One September evening,
Dr. Malakis?
Jill Johnson was babysitting for the two young children of a wealthy doctor.
Okay, bye.
They told her where they would be and when they would be home. They told her everything she had to know, except what to do when a stranger calls.
Hello?
Have you checked the children?
What? Hello, could you get me the police?
Well, there's really nothing we can do about it down here.
Have you checked the children?
She's watching me through the windows.
Well, if he calls again, we can try to trace it.
Why haven't you checked the children?
Please, can't you help me? I'm all alone here. What do you want?
Your blood.
Leave me alone!
Jill, this is Sergeant Sacker. We've traced the call. It's coming from inside the house. Jill, just get out of that house.
The call is coming from inside the house. These 8 words have been uttered by countless children throughout the years, and they mark one of the most popular urban legends of all time. Children have been telling this story, which is sometimes called The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs, for decades. This urban legend also captured the imaginations of many young people, so much so that it eventually inspired the making of the 1979 horror film When a Stranger Calls, as well as the remake in the early 2000s. But what if there was some actual truth to this urban legend? Because in the year 1950, 13-year-old Janett Christman was brutally raped and strangled while she was babysitting a 3-year-old boy in Columbia, Missouri. This 100% proves that truth can be far more horrifying than any urban legend ever could be. Hey guys, welcome to episode 40 of the Always Talking Crime podcast. I am your host, Kimi, and I'm super excited you're here. If you're a first-time listener, especially welcome. And if you're a long-time listener and you found me again, welcome back. I'm so excited to do this podcast. This little bitty baby podcast. It's been so much fun for me. But I am bringing you a new episode because it's spooky season. We are going to talk about the urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs and the actual case that was inspired by that urban legend, or the urban legend was inspired because of this case. It took place in 1950. I do want to mention that I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce the victim's name. I've been trying to do a ton of research. I hear it both ways. I hear more people calling her Janett Christman, but I really feel like it's Janett. It's Janett, and for some reason, my mouth always wants to say Janett instead of Janet. So my apologies if I am incorrect and it is actually Janet, but I'm going to say Janett just because it rolls off my tongue, and I feel like that is her name. But again, disclaimer, I could be entirely wrong. But let's just get on with the story. In 1950, Columbia, Missouri was a thriving college town, and it was home to the University of Missouri. About 30,000 people called Columbia home, But as more and more people relocated to that town, new neighborhoods began to pop up everywhere along the outskirts of the cities. Columbia's town center on East Walnut Street housed a very popular restaurant and cafe called Ernie's Steakhouse, and it was owned and operated by the Christman family. This family also conveniently lived above the family business. Charles and Lula Mae Christman had 3 daughters, baby Cheryl, 11-year-old Rita, and 13-year-old Janett. Now, Janett was a popular 8th grader who went to Jefferson Junior High. She was an independent girl who seemed older and wiser than she actually was. She loved going to church and she played the piano in the church choir. Easter was a highlight on her calendar, as there were many church events around that time that she enjoyed participating in. For spending money, Janett spent her free time babysitting for 2 different families, the Romacks and the Muellers. On March 18th of 1950, there was a high school dance that was planned for all of the 8th graders, but when the Romacks asked if she could babysit their 3-year-old son Gregory, she chose the babysitting job over the dance. She was saving up money to pay for a suit that she had put on layaway. It was for a very important Easter church event, and by babysitting that night, she'd have enough money to finally take that home with her. So she was super excited, super responsible. Gotta love that about her, because there's not too many 13-year-olds that think that way. Anyways, Janett arrived at the Romacks' home on Stewart Road at 7:30 p.m. that night. The house was on a large property in the city limits of Columbia. It was a small, single-story home, and it was perched on a hill. Since the area was on the outskirts of town, it was still undeveloped, and the home was pretty much isolated. Anne was 8 months pregnant with her second child, and she and Ed had decided to go out for the night. It was going to be their last date night before the baby was due to be born. They were going over to the Moon Valley Villa on the other side of town so that they could play bridge with the Muellers and some of their other friends. Little Gregory was already asleep in his room when Janett arrived, so it was looking to be an easy night. Like, wasn't that the best thing for those of you who babysat as a teenager? Like, how awesome is that if the kids are already asleep and you don't have to deal with them? You can just talk on the phone to your friends, watch TV, eat all the snacks, right? So anyways, it was going to be an easy night for Janett. The young boy liked to sleep with the radio on, and Anne Romack told Janett to leave the radio playing for him. Before they left the house, this is kind of weird. Ed Romack wanted to make sure that Janett and his 3-year-old son were safe, so I guess he had a reason to be cautious, because there had been a series of sexual assaults that had plagued the quiet town of Columbia in very recent months. The first rape had occurred in the days leading up to Halloween the year previous. A 16-year-old babysitter had been assaulted by a man who had been wearing a white mask. And just a month after that, an 18-year-old college student named Sally Johnson was visiting her parents. She fell asleep on the sofa at their home, and she was suddenly awakened by a masked man who attempted to rape her. But fortunately for Sally, she was able to fend him off. The very next day after that, a couple who had parked at the local Lover's Lane was held up at gunpoint by a man wearing a white hooded mask. He tied up the man and robbed him before sexually assaulting his girlfriend. Then, in December, a 26-year-old peeping Tom by the name of Jack Bradford had been caught in the act of stalking a woman inside her home and had been arrested. After a week in prison, Bradford confessed to the Halloween week rape, as well as the attempted assault on Sally Johnson. But because there were no more reports of rape in the area, police were confident that they had the right man in custody. But still, on that night in March of 1950, the weird part, since Ed still felt like it was important to be erring on the side of caution, he showed Janett, a 13-year-old girl, how to use his shotgun, just in case there was any trouble. So I thought that was kind of odd. Like, I was trying to put myself in that place, like back when I was a babysitter, if one of the parents had taught me how to shoot a gun to protect myself. Not that it's bad, because, there's nothing bad about that. It's just weird because she's a 13-year-old girl. But anyways, that's just like my thoughts to it. Like, I would have been like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't be babysitting. But anyways, that gun in question was kept in a living room cupboard, which was right next to the front door. He instructed her to keep the front door locked and told Janett that if anybody stopped by, that she should turn on the porch light. Janett assured them that everything would be okay and told them to just have a great time and enjoy their night out. Ann and Ed Romack left shortly before 8 p.m., and Ed made sure that the door was locked behind him. With the soothing sounds of the radio coming from little Gregory's room, Janett settled in for the night of babysitting. It was a rather eerie night outside with icy temperatures and howling winds as a storm drew near. One of Janett's friends was also babysitting for another family that Saturday night, and she later recalled that there was something very ominous to that night. She had kept checking the doors to make sure they were locked, but still felt restless. Little did she know, trouble was not brewing on her doorstep, but of her friend Janett Christman. At 10:35 p.m., Boone County Sheriff's Department received an alarming phone call. Officer Ray McCowan answered, asking what the emergency was. He could hear the wails of a woman screaming in fear, and all she said was, "Come quick." There was no way of tracing the call because, after all, this was back in the 1950s and technology was pretty much non-existent. All he could do was wait by the phone and hope that the woman would call back again, but sadly she did not. When Officer McGowan recalled the phone call, he said that he had urged her to calm down and just tell him where she was, but then there was just a silence, not the sound of a receiver being hung up, just silence. Shortly after this had happened, Ann Romack decided to call home to make sure that everything was okay. The storm was raging on, and with the wind and with the thunder, she was really concerned that little Gregory would wake up and be scared. But she was not able to get through. All she kept getting was a busy signal. Anne was not too concerned, though. She assumed the phone line was out simply because of the storm. After an enjoyable night playing cards with friends, the Romacks left the Moon Valley Villa in East Columbia at 1:15 a.m., and they arrived home in just 20 minutes. The storm was raging and the driveway was really muddy. The first thing Ed had noticed was that the porch light was turned on. The couple got out of the car and ran through the sleet to the front porch. They noticed that the Venetian blind in the front room window was open, which of course they thought was a little unusual. Ed put his key in the front door locked and fiddled it a little bit, but he found that the door was actually left unlocked, although he remembered right then and there that he had locked the front door behind him, so he knew that something just wasn't right. As soon as they entered the house, the Romacks unfortunately discovered Janett's body lying in a pool of blood, with her legs spread wide open. And around her neck was an electric cord, and she was no longer living. There was a broken window in the living room, and Anne noticed that the receiver of the telephone had been left dangling by its cord. In a panic, both Ed and Anne rushed to their son's bedroom, but fortunately, little Gregory was safe and left untouched. Somehow, I don't know how, but he had managed to sleep through the very violent attack that ended his babysitter's life just 3 days before her 14th birthday, and just a couple of yards down the hall from his bedroom. Ed called police right away to report Janett's murder. The Romacks' home was exactly 100 yards outside of Columbia city limits, which meant that technically the case should have been taken on by the county sheriff's department. But since Columbia was a relatively small town, the first responding officer was from the city police department. Within an hour of Ed Romack's phone call, investigators from both agencies were at the scene. And soon, of course, a fight over which department had jurisdiction over the case immediately arose. It ended in a stalemate, so multiple officers ended up, working on the case, rolling up their sleeves, trying to gather as much evidence as they possibly could. Now, this conflict between agencies unfortunately carried on throughout the entire investigation, and it defined the case. Law enforcement received harsh criticism from the public, who was urging them to focus on finding Janett's murderer instead of playing power games, or as I like to call it, seeing whose dick was bigger. We see that all the time, and it's total bullshit. I feel like sometimes they forget what's important, and the victim should always be the most important. Evidence at the crime scene in the Romack home told the sordid tale of Janett's desperate last moments. There were blood smears found all over the living room and throughout the kitchen, leading up to the back door that had been left wide open. Just a few feet away from where her body laid was the phone, the one that she had used to make that desperate attempt, to call for help. Investigators in the scene could see that Janett had been hit over the head on both sides by a blunt object and had been stabbed multiple times with a small pointed object. It was described as a small lead pipe, but the coroner later concluded that the injuries were most likely from being stabbed with a mechanical pencil. Apparently, back in those days, mechanical pencils were made sturdier than they are today. Today, they're plastic, but back then, I guess that they were more metal. Janett had scratch marks all over her face as well, and also had someone's skin underneath her fingernails, which proved that she had put up a tremendous fight before she was sexually assaulted and strangled to death. It was not clear if she was raped before or after she died. Her legs were left wide open and the cord was hanging around her neck, but the killer had cut the cord off of an electric iron that was in the home by using a pair of scissors, and that's what he had strangled her with. Anne Romack had later said that the iron and scissors were kept in the sewing room down the hall. So how did the killer know to find them there? Investigators looked at the side window of the home that had been broken with a garden hoe. Outside of this window were several footprints which were made by an adult male shoe. Apparently, the intruder had used a sawhorse so that he could reach the window. Bloodhounds were brought in from the Algoa prison farm to establish which direction the attacker may have fled. The dogs picked up a scent and followed it for about a mile. It went up from Stewart Road to West Boulevard and then across West Ash Street before they lost the scent trail. Inside the living room on top of the piano, which was near the broken window, were some muddy papers. Police theorized that they were possibly used by the intruder to clean the mud off the bottom of his shoes. At first, it seemed apparent that the killer had entered the home through this window, but other than glass shards on the floor, nothing else in front of the window was left undisturbed. The Venetian blinds were drawn down, and it did not look like anyone damaged it climbing through the window. In addition, when the Romacks had arrived home, the front door had been left unlocked. The loaded shotgun next to the door had been left literally untouched, which made police come to the conclusion that Janett must have known her attacker. So she probably had let him into the house without any kind of concern at all for her safety. The layout of the Romacks' home was simple. It was a rectangular block with the front door in the middle, which opened up straight into the living room. The kitchen was adjacent to that living room towards the back, with 3 bedrooms and a bathroom down a short hallway to the right side of the living room. if one had entered through the front door. When the Romacks arrived home that night, the front door was closed but left unlocked. The kitchen door was wide open, and the living room window to the left of the entrance had been broken. Police theorized that the killer broke the side window as a distraction. He wanted to force Janett to go to the opposite side of the living room, away from where Ed's loaded shotgun was kept. Investigators were feeling that the intruder was familiar with the house and knew just where Ed kept his firearm. Ed Romack was naturally the first suspect, but he was quickly ruled out. There were tons of people who vouched for his whereabouts that entire evening. He had been playing bridge at the Moon Valley Villa and had only left the establishment after 1 a.m. with his wife. Law enforcement worked around the clock to solve the case. They staked out various areas and questioned as many residents in the area as they possibly could. Officers kept constant surveillance on the Romack home, hoping that the killer would return to the scene of the crime. But the hours and hours and hours spent outside in the cold weather yielded absolutely no new information. Concerned residents called in tips, and the police followed up on each and every one of them. The emergency number had been changed to 112, which is easier to dial than the number that had been in use at that time, which was 3132. However, many of the potential suspects had absolutely nothing to do with the murder, and police realized that many of the calls were made out of racial prejudice, of course. Unfortunately, during that time, Columbia was very much a Confederate town, and it was not at all uncommon for black people to be accused of crimes that they didn't even fucking commit. After Janett's murder, the entire town of Columbia was definitely on edge. Parents tried to shield their young children from the terrible news by hiding newspapers, but sooner or later, everyone knew exactly what had happened to Janett. The custom of babysitting had come to a complete halt. Parents kept their teenage daughters at home instead, and gone were the carefree days of young people earning their own spending money by babysitting to help fuel their budding independence. This case was one of the most heinous crimes ever committed in the area. There was one other case, however, that police decided had undeniable similarities. Janett's death reminded investigators of an unsolved murder which had occurred less than a mile away from the Romack house, just 4 years prior. In February of 1946, 20-year-old college student Mary Lou Jenkins had come home to Columbia so that she could visit her parents. On Tuesday evening, on the 5th of February, her mother was caring for an elderly neighbor and decided to stay the night over there since the neighbor was feeling unwell. So that left Mary Lou at their home alone. Her mother could see the house from where she was staying at the neighbor's house and had told Mary Lou that if anything went wrong, she should turn on the light, open the blinds, and follow up with a phone call. It was late in the night when her mother looked across the street and noticed that the light was on and that the blinds were pulled up. But because there was no phone call from Mary Lou, her mother assumed that she was okay. When the mother returned home the following morning, she found Mary Lou's body in the living room. Mary Lou had been raped and strangled with an extension cord. And just like there had been in the case of Janett's murder, Mary Lou's killer had also cut the electrical cord with a pair of scissors before finally strangling her with it. The Jenkins home was located just 2 short blocks away from the Romack's home. There had been no sign of forced entry, which led investigators to believe that, just like Janett, Mary Lou must have known her assailant and did not expect or suspect that he had posed any kind of threat to her. Soon after Mary Lou's murder, a 35-year-old local mentally disabled man by the name of Floyd Cochran was arrested for killing his wife. He was arrested just moments before he could kill himself. Once he was in police custody, he freely admitted that he had killed his wife during a domestic dispute. But his interrogating officers were not done with him. Floyd was subjected to more than 10 hours of questioning, after which he confessed to killing Mary Lou Jenkins as well. Later on, just shortly before his execution, he retracted his confession, but in the eyes of the law, he had been convicted, so of course, the case had been closed. That is, until Janett Christman's murder happened. Historians who have studied the two cases believe that Cochran was innocent the whole time and that his confession was absolutely coerced by the police. The fact that Cochran had been a black man and that he was suspected of raping and killing a young white woman did not help his case much at that time either. In 1950, investigators kept Mary Lou Jenkins' murder in the back of their minds while they continued to work on Janett's case. Both of them had let their killer inside the home willingly and had closed the front door once he was inside. At some point, both of them had realized that they were in danger and tried to call for help. Mary Lou tried to signal her mother, and Janett attempted to call police. The person left both homes undetected, and there was not a single neighbor who reported any kind of strange men stalking the area. To them, it meant that the man was perhaps known in the community. One name that kept coming up in the Christman investigation was the one of Robert Mueller. He was the father of the other family who Janett occasionally babysat for, and she knew him quite well. Ed Romack told police that he had known Mueller since high school, and after graduating, Mueller did 1 year of college studying acting before he signed up to serve in World War II. When he returned home from the war, he helped out at his family's restaurant, which was called Mueller's Virginia Cafe. So that's interesting. They have a family restaurant, and then Janett Christman's family also had a family restaurant. Anyways, Mueller also had worked as a tailor. He was also always sharply dressed, and many people recalled him habitually having a, get ready for this, guys, mechanical pencil on him in his pocket. So what are the chances, right? Ed Romack and Robert Mueller had many mutual friends and often spent time together. Ed later admitted to the police that Mueller had quite the roving eye, and he was known to make very inappropriate comments about young women. He had a particular interest in his babysitter Janett and had mentioned in the past to Ed that he really appreciated Janett's young female form, her hips, and also made mention of her budding breasts. So disgusting. Mueller had also speculated whether or not Janett was still a virgin. And this was a conversation that left Romack with a really bad taste in his mouth. On another occasion, Mueller said to Romack that he had fantasized about having sex with a young virgin, which is completely weird. I can't believe men literally have free conversations like this. I feel like it would have been best if Romack had discontinued his friendship with Mueller at this point, because Mueller obviously cannot keep disgusting thoughts inside his head. Those are inside thoughts. If you're going to think disgusting, perverted things like that, you should at least know that you don't say those fucking words out loud, right? But Mueller did. Ann Romack later told investigators that Robert Mueller had made her feel 5,000 fucking % uncomfortable. Just one day before Janett's death, he had gone to the Romack's home to measure Ann for alternations that she needed to be fit for a dress. Ann claimed that he had groped her breast on that occasion and that she had sent him away. According to Anne, Mueller was a man who didn't use words, he used his hands. She didn't tell her husband about the incident because she feared that he would have got really pissed off and what he might have done to Mueller. And I've literally been in this same position before, so I know it's kind of hard to make that decision on, whether to tell the person that you're in a relationship or a marriage, what had happened, with their friend, hitting on you. So, I get it. I really wish she would have said something, because I'm sure that they would have not gone out, playing bridge together had Ed known about what Mueller fucking did to his wife just the day before. But anyways, the groping incident happened inside the Romack home, in the sewing room, inside the fucking motherfucking sewing room, just the day before Janett was killed. And that is where the iron and the scissors that cut the cord were kept. Seems suspect. On the morning of Janett's death, Mueller's wife called Janett herself and had asked her to babysit for the family. But Janett responded that she had already promised the Romacks that she would look after little Gregory that night. The Muellers had to find another babysitter, so Robert Mueller obviously knew where Janett was going to be and that she was going to be there all by herself that night. The Muellers attended that same bridge night, like I already explained, as the Romacks, and witnesses had told police that Robert Mueller did disappear for about an hour or two. When he returned, he told everybody that he had to go home because the doctor was called to check in on his sick child, and he wanted to be there for that consultation. I don't understand why people lie and make up stories like that, because of course the police are going to question the Mueller's home doctor, and when they did, the doctor denied seeing Robert that night or even visiting the Mueller home at all. So Robert's story for leaving the Moon Valley Villa did seem a bit weak. If one of the Mueller children had been sick, in fact sick enough to call out a doctor late on a Saturday night, would not both Mueller and his wife have both called it a night and gone home to take care of their kid? So it's crazy to think that he would just go home and check on their child, and that his wife, the mother of that child, that sick child, would still be out partying with their friends. That's stupid. Another fact that made Mueller look even more suspicious was the fact that he had called Ed Romack at 9 a.m. the following morning. Just the next day after Janett had been murdered. He offered to help him clean up all the blood at his home. However, the news of the murder had not even been made public at that time. And even if the rumors were floating around town, how did he even know that there was blood at the scene of the crime when Janett died of strangulation? Romack told the investigators that in the days after the murder, Mueller liked to theorize about Janett's death. He had said to Romack that it would have been easy to convince Janett to open the door. And he had said something like, all I'd have to say was, Ed sent me to pick up some poker chips. So Ed found it odd that Mueller would say something like that and totally felt that it implicated him in the murder. According to Ed, Robert Mueller even went so far as to say, I might have done it and then forgotten about it. Like, what the fuck? That's a weird fucking thing to even joke about. Boone County Sheriff Powell, as well as an arresting deputy, took Mueller in for questioning, but unfortunately, they were fucking assholes and did not work by the book. Instead of taking Mueller into the Boone County Sheriff's Department, they took him instead to the arresting officer's farmhouse. It was there that they questioned him relentlessly all throughout the night. When morning came around, they transported him to Jefferson City and asked him to take a polygraph test, which he did pass. And, polygraphs don't mean shit anyways. I'm sure the polygraph tests back in the 50s, were complete garbage, so that doesn't even fucking matter, in my opinion. And maybe yours too. Anyways, at that time, polygraph tests carried a lot of weight in an investigation. So the fact that Mueller passed that test meant to officers that he was telling the truth, and therefore investigators had to release him. In the 1950s, polygraph testing was a very sophisticated investigative tool, and the results derived from tests were considered to be indisputable at that time. Thank goodness, over the years, as we all know now, scientists have questioned the validity of lie detector tests in criminal investigations. There are ways to cheat the test, and results are often dubious. In addition, if a person is a psychopath, lies are especially not so easy to detect. Consider the fact of the Green River killer, that Gary Ridgway dude. He passed his polygraph test in 1984, and he had confessed almost 20 years later of having killed 7 more women in the time after he passed that fucking polygraph. In June of 1950, a grand jury investigated the probability that Mueller was the one who had raped and murdered Janett Christman. Most people felt that Mueller was guilty, but in a strange turn of events, he was not indicted. Instead, the grand jury reprimanded the county sheriff's department and the city police for their inefficiency. There was absolutely nothing more said or done about Robert Mueller. Mueller was furious about the way he was treated by police and sued the sheriff's department for detaining him unlawfully, but in the end, he thankfully lost that lawsuit. County Sheriff Powell explained that they had taken Mueller to a deputy's residence in an attempt to avoid publicity. However, most people reckoned it was done so that Columbia City Police would not know what they were up to. The community did not have any warm, fuzzy feelings whatsoever about Robert Mueller. Despite so much circumstantial evidence against him in the Christman case, he was still a free fucking man, and people started talking through, and his past did come back to haunt him. During Robert Mueller's senior year of high school, he had been the chairman of the senior play stage set committee at Hickman High School. Those were a lot of words just then. His classmates all remembered that he had been in charge of making masks for that school play. He used white sacks and cut out holes for the eyes, just like the mask that the 1949 rapist had worn when he had attacked. So, was it possible that Mueller was not only Janett's killer, but had also been responsible for the death of Mary Lou Jenkins? The Mueller family left town and moved to Tucson, Arizona. Robert Mueller joined the U.S. Air Force and lived to the age of 83. He passed away in 2006. No more rapes or murders ever occurred in Columbia after that motherfucker moved away from that area. The Romacks were, of course, traumatized by Janett's death, so they sold their home and they relocated to Idaho. Many years later, little Gregory Romack, the 3-year-old baby boy who had been inside the home when Janett was murdered, he went and revisited his former family home in order to pay his respects to the babysitter that had lost her life while caring for him. The Christman family remained in Columbia and kept Ernie's Steakhouse running for many years. They only decided to move away when Janett's father, Charles, passed away in 1974. Although most people in Columbia believe that Robert Mueller was the one who had murdered Janett on that stormy night in March of 1950, he was never ever charged, and her case still remains quote unquote unsolved to this very day. Now, before I tell you about another similar case to the one of Janett Christman, I want to talk to you guys about another true crime podcast that I'm enjoying. I know I've been kind of doing this for the past few episodes, but I've been following this other newish, it's a newer podcast like mine. They're up to episode 36. I just rated them 5 stars on Spotify today. I'm really, really enjoying them. Let's take a listen to their trailer.
Hi, I'm Courtney.
And I'm Patrick.
And this is our true crime podcast.
Evil Pudding.
We are a husband and wife duo.
I am ex-military and law enforcement.
And I'm a true crime professional fanatic.
And we will together cover the most depraved and most shocking offenders and events that you probably have ever heard of.
That's right. Only the most evil are covered here.
So join us once a week
as we serve up some evil pudding.
They are so fun. And I think what I like best about them is I really relate to Patrick with his background in law enforcement and military, because I was actually married. My son's father was in the Navy, in the U.S. Navy for 10 years. And he was actually a kennel master, a dog handler. So just hearing their podcast and their episodes and Patrick chiming in with his experience, it just reminds me a lot. I really miss the military life. I really enjoyed learning about like all the things that they did. And not that there weren't that many crazy things that had happened during my ex-husband's time in the military, but I learned a lot about how the dogs, the working dogs, operate and their training, and it was just super fun. I really enjoy their podcast, so please give them a listen if you're ever looking for something new to dive into. But anyways, another murder with many similarities took place in the college town of La Crosse, Wisconsin, just 3 years after Janett Christman's death. So these cases are not related in any way, and investigators have never believed that the crimes were committed by the same person. However, the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley also played a part in the urban legend of the babysitter and the man upstairs. 15-year-old Evelyn Hartley was the daughter of a professor at La Crosse State University. Today it is better known as the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Evelyn, or Evie as she was called, had an older brother and a younger sister. Evie was a straight-A student at Central High School, and she did as many activities as she possibly could at school, and I relate to that. So Evie loved going to church, and she loved to play the piano in the church choir. So her and Janett had that in common as well. On October 24th of 1953, one of her dad's colleagues, Professor Viggo Rasmussen, asked Evelyn if she could babysit his 20-month-old daughter, Janice. His regular babysitter had canceled out on them because it was a night of the local homecoming game. Evelyn was supposed to go to that game too, but she decided she would rather have extra spending money and accepted the babysitting job. She also used the opportunity to study, and she took a couple of her school books, her textbooks, with her. She was actually pretty reluctant to go that day, but her mother told her that she could not let the Rasmussens down at the last minute, and Evelyn did agree. So she was probably having second thoughts, thinking, oh, now I'm going to miss like the homecoming. Maybe I should not have agreed to babysit, but Mom did the right thing, I guess, and set her straight, like as far as like responsibility wise. I'm sure her mother, probably, wished that she had not, after what happens. But like Mom was actually teaching Evelyn, she was teaching her daughter to be responsible and to live up to her commitments. So I really commend her for that. At 6:30 p.m., Professor Rasmussen picked Evie up at her family home on Johnson Street. They lived only 5 minutes away at Hochler Drive-In, which was then the new Cooley Drive addition. I don't know what that means, but that's what, when I was researching this, that's what it came up with. So it was supposedly a newly developed neighborhood, or probably like a suburb, that had many homes still under construction. When they arrived, Madeline Rasmussen welcomed Evie because this was the first time Evie had ever babysat for them. Madeline instructed Evelyn to put little Janice to bed at 7 p.m. and cover her at 7:15. At 6:45, the professor, his wife, and their oldest child left to go to the homecoming game. Evie's dad, Richard, asked her to call home at 8:30 p.m. just to check in. From the moment Evie left, her mother was feeling uneasy. She had an impending sense of doom, but Richard assured her that everything was going to be okay. He was certain Evie would call and soon she'd be back home safely. 8:30 came and went, and Evie never called. Concerned, Richard called the Rasmussen home, but there wasn't any answer. He tried to call a couple more times, but Evie still did not pick up. He decided to drive over there to check in on his daughter and make sure she was okay. When he arrived to the home at 9:20 p.m., the lights were on inside the Rasmussen home and all of the doors were locked. He rang the doorbell, but nobody came to answer the door. So he walked around the house and he saw an open basement window, which is never a good fucking sign, right? And he saw that the screen had been removed. I think my heart would have sank right then. 3 other windows also had pry marks on them. So whoever the intruder was, it was evident that they were determined to get inside. Like nothing was literally going to stop them. Richard went back to the front porch and called for Evie, but there was still no reply. When he peeped through a window, he could see one of Evie's shoes in the living room, along with her eyeglasses. He could see them both lying on the carpet, and the eyeglasses were there also, and they were shattered. Determined to get inside, Richard climbed in through that basement window, dreading what he was going to find. Inside was a stepladder, which belonged to the Rasmussens. Near the window, inside the basement, that's where Richard found Evie's other shoe. The living room itself was turned upside down. All the furniture had been removed. Evie's books were strewn on the floor, but there was absolutely no sign of her anywhere. Richard rushed to the nursery and found the baby sound asleep and untouched. She was not covered with her blanket, which meant that whatever had happened to Evie must have taken place sometime between 7 p.m. and 7:15 p.m. Richard, of course, felt numb with shock and went to a neighbor's house to ask for help. It was 10 minutes to 10 when they called police. The first police officers arrived to the scene within a matter of minutes. They entered the strange scene. All of the doors were locked, and the only way anyone could have entered or exited was through that basement window. Every door inside the house was locked, except for the door leading to the basement. In the yard outside the window were 2 pools of blood. The largest of the 2 stains were about 18 inches in diameter. On the wall of a neighbor's garage was a bloody handprint, 4 feet off the ground. Investigators concluded that Evelyn was either dragged or carried, and that her abductor stopped to catch a breath before continuing on his way. Every time he stopped, a large puddle of blood stained the ground. Police dogs, working dogs, were able to trace Evelyn's scent for 2 blocks, all the way up to Cooley Drive. She was most likely placed into a vehicle and taken from there. In the Rasmussen's yard were footprints made by a size 11 shoe, like a sneaker. Investigators followed the tracks and also found some clear footprints around other homes. So police suspected that a prowler was staking out the area, and he was simply looking for the best house to hit. He believed that Evie was not necessarily the prime target, but that her abduction was totally a crime of opportunity. Talking to neighbors, some of them reported seeing a suspicious car driving around the neighborhood earlier that evening. It was light colored, but nobody was 100% sure about the make or model of the car. One neighbor also recalled hearing screams around 7:15 p.m., which was an hour before Richard Hartley arrived looking for his daughter and checking in on her. The neighbor recalled the scream was interrupted suddenly, but he thought it was like neighborhood kids who had been called inside by their parents and told to keep quiet. A crime like Evie's disappearance was such an unusual occurrence in La Crosse. If people heard screams, it was not unusual to assume it came from kids playing out in the streets. Police searched the area until just after 1 a.m., and then they called it off with the intention of resuming the search again the following day. More than 1,000 people showed up at the Rasmussen home around noon the following day, offering to assist them in the search. However, sadly, Evelyn was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Hartley had a premonition the night before that something terrible was about to happen at exactly the same time a witness told police that they had heard someone screaming. And that is so freaking weird. So when she saw the bloodstains in the Rasmussen's yard the following day, she told the reporter at the scene that she absolutely knew without a doubt that her daughter, Evelyn, was no longer alive. Just hurts my heart, you know? Ugh. Anyway, air searches as well as ground searches continued despite hope of Evie still being alive. The general unspoken feeling was that they were looking for a body and not for an abducted teen. Detectives were searching everywhere, even inside the sewers. All known sex offenders were questioned, but there were still no prominent suspects. Police had the uncomfortable task of having to question Evelyn's father just to exclude him as a suspect. If Evelyn was still alive and well when he arrived shortly after 9 p.m., he could have been the one who had harmed her. He was cleared by the crime lab on Friday, October 30th, which was a week after his daughter disappeared. Another witness came forward saying that he saw a two-tone green 1941 or 1942 Buick driving recklessly on the night in question. There was a driver in the front and a man and a girl in the back. The girl was slumped forwards with her head against the front seat. Police sent out communications for all cars in the area to be searched. Gas station attendants were to look in every single car for blood or any other kind of suspicious evidence. If the owner refused, they would be reported instantly to police. Once a car had been searched, they stuck a sticker on the windshield that read, quote, "My car is okay." In the days that follow, pieces of blood-stained clothing were found in various locations. There was a pair of women's underwear, like the kind Evie wore, as well as a bra, and those were found on Highway 14, which was just south of town. Police caught a solid break when they discovered a pair of tennis shoes and a cut-off denim jacket further down Highway 14. Both the jacket and shoes were covered in blood that matched Evelyn's blood type. The shoes matched the prints found outside and inside the Rasmussen home, and dirt from the Rasmussen's yard matched to the dirt on the shoes. The shoes were worn in by two people with different sized feet, which made investigators wonder if it had been perhaps a stolen pair of shoes, or perhaps it was a pair of shoes that were borrowed or purchased at a thrift store. Despite the clothing and a clear timeline of events on that night, police weren't any closer to solving the mystery of what had happened to Evelyn Hartley. Opinion in the town was divided. Was Evie dead, or was there a chance that she could still be alive? The Hartleys received so many letters, and a lot of them expressed sympathy and pledged support. But there was also some sinister letters received, like one that was sent from Devil's Lake, North Dakota. The person wrote, "Just a note to let you know that Miss Hartley is in my power. Don't try to trace this letter because I didn't leave any evidence. I'll let you know the ransom letter. You stupid people almost had me back there, but I managed to escape." The letter was signed with the skull and crossbones and could never be traced. Another letter they received read, "Don't worry anymore about that Evelyn Hartley. She went away with a man from La Crosse, is fine and well, and after all that commotion is afraid to come home, phone, or write. You will hear from her when all has calmed down. All that so-called evidence was planted to mislead. She wanted to be forgotten, is already sorry of her bargain. I would have written you before had I known. This one was signed MM, and it was sent from St. Paul, Minnesota. It was written in a different handwriting from the first letter, and experts confirmed that it was not sent by the same person, or that they were not sent by the same person. Police and Evie's family did not think it was possible that she would run off. It would have been out of character totally for her to do that. She was a diligent student, and she was really close to her family. On November 22nd, the day that would have been Evelyn's 14th birthday, a memorial service was held. Despite tip-offs and taunting letters, her family felt that she was no longer alive, and it was time that they just had to accept it. Dead or alive, police were not about to give up, though. In May of 1954, mass lie detector tests were planned for all college-age young men and teenage boys in the La Crosse area. Police planned to test close to 2,000 people, but the school board objected, and in the end, only 300 were tested. Police decided then to bring in a special investigator to assist because they could simply not come up with any new clues. Former detective A.M. Josephson was given the full-time job of working on Evelyn's case. And after many years of painstaking investigation, even after his contract with the police had expired, he concluded that the intruder at the Rasmussen home was a steeplejack. He based this on marks found on the denim jacket with the tennis shoes off of Highway 14. It had a distinct faded line, like the person who wore the jacket often wore a harness, the type of harness used by people working on scaffolds or on high buildings. Josephson could never find any additional evidence to support his theory, though, and he was dismissed by the county. Everyone in La Crosse was scared and fearful of who could be prowling the streets at night, taking their teenage daughters. Now, as a matter of interest, because I've covered this case, Ed Gein was considered to be a suspect in Evelyn's disappearance as well. At that time, he was visiting a relative who lived about 2 blocks away from the Rasmussen home. When he was arrested, he denied any involvement in this case. There was also not any physical evidence linking Gein to Evelyn at his home, the home where he kept all those disgusting souvenirs of his victims, remember? If you did not listen to those episodes, I think I did it in 2 parts, you need to go back and listen to them. They're just so terrifyingly awful. But anyways, Ed Gein passed 2 lie detector tests, so police were satisfied that he was not Evelyn's abductor. But what are the chances, right? It's so weird. Like, how could somebody be abducted and then there's like a literal serial killer and disgusting human being just 2 blocks away? So it seems kind of suspect. Despite many efforts and generous rewards posted, the case remained unsolved. In 2004, a recording of a conversation resurfaced that could possibly solve the mystery. A man meant to record a band playing at a bar, but when he listened to the tape, a conversation could be heard. A man named Clyde Tywee Peterson implicated himself in that recording, and he also implicated Jack Gulper and an unnamed third man in Evelyn's disappearance. He had claimed that they buried Evelyn's body in Lafarge, Wisconsin. By the time the information was given to police, though, Gulper and the unnamed man were already deceased and could not verify the story. Police followed up, but have never found any evidence to support Peterson's claims. Another unsettling theory emerged when the body of an unidentified woman was found, dumped off the side of a road in Viroqua, Wisconsin in the year 1984, less than an hour's drive south of La Crosse. The woman had been beaten badly before she died, and her hands had been cut off. Pathologist reports estimated the woman to have been in her 50s or 60s. Forensic artists were able to draw a facial impression of what she looked like, and the picture had an eerie resemblance to the young Evelyn, and even more strikingly to Evelyn's mother when she had been in her 50s. In 1984, Evelyn Hartley would have been 51 years old. So this theory implied that Evelyn had been captured on that fateful night in 1953, kept and abused for 30 years before she eventually passed away. What do you guys think? I mean, that's entirely possible as well. Whoever it was that was responsible for the disappearance of Evelyn Hartley and the rape and murder of Janett Christman managed to get away with it. Their deeds were so heinous and heartless that it made its way into a nation's folklore. Parents warn their daughters, you can never be too cautious when a stranger calls.